of a series of tapes on the history of Hawarden, Iowa, being prepared by Proctor Maynard for the Sioux Valley Historical Society at the request of some of their members. On other tapes, previous tapes, I have explained the circumstances under which I have been asked to prepare these tapes. I will not repeat those circumstances for this tape. One of the topics that I wish to discuss at this time is the effect of the frontier, the possible effect of the frontier on the conscription or draft in the North in the American Civil War. The American Civil War, as we call it in the North, or the war between the states, as many Southerners prefer to call it, lasted from 1861 to 1865. Early in 1863, the North passed a conscription law. The South had done so even earlier than that. This conscription law had, among other things, a provision that young men about to be called up in the draft could hire a substitute to serve in their place. Quite a good many did so. Some later very prominent, such as J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. Others felt that it was not morally right to hire someone to perhaps be killed in their place. Historians have rather fully discussed the varied responses to this moral dilemma. One aspect that I have wondered about and have found little information on is how much of a role did the frontier play in draft evasion? It is a valid question for the Missouri and Big Sioux Valley areas in the 1860s. Both the census of 1850 and 1860 show very few settlers in that northwest Iowa area. I have from time to time talked with various persons who placed their ancestors in the area shortly before or after the early 1860s. Were these men just missed by the draft enforcement? Were they draft evaders? Did they hire substitutes when they were called? Were they lucky enough not to get called before the end of the war? To date, I have not found an adequate discussion of such questions as this in the literature that I have read. The census reports for 1850, 1860, and 1870 do seem to raise another question about this area. Plymouth, Sioux, and Lyon counties and Union County, Dakota Territory, do seem to have begun settlement at a slower pace at a later date than areas all around them, especially on the Iowa side. Was this due to less attractive soil and terrain, to Indian problems, to the slower progress of the railroads in this more hilly area, or what were the circumstances that caused this apparent delay in settlement? My grandfather, Dr. Edwards Maynard, enlisted shortly after Gettysburg when his draft call was due to come up, and he then served in a company of Pennsylvania volunteers that hadn't been involved in the Gettysburg conflict until the end in 1865. He apparently taught school for a couple of years, then came west to Sioux City and Dakota Territory. He may have come west first in 1867 to look over the area, and then gone back to marry my grandmother, Mary Sophie Heggie, of a pioneer Michigan family, then teaching near his home in Pennsylvania and living with relatives of hers in that area. They had met before he enlisted in the Pennsylvania Volunteers. They then were married after the war was over, and then they both rode the first regularly scheduled train, passenger train, into Sioux City in 1868. They homesteaded land northwest of Elk Point, South Dakota, about 4 miles, may have gotten some additional land under the so-called Tree Planting Act, and perhaps some as a veteran. I have not been able to establish just how much land they did acquire in these manners. It may be of a little passing interest that Grandmother Maynard's father helped organize Bridgewater Township, Washtenaw County, Michigan, was its first township clerk for some years, and one of the first teachers in the area. Grandfather Maynard's grandmother was a Choate of the family that founded Choate School and made the major contribution to the startup of the Boston Public Library. All this may have some bearing on my father's boyhood education. I know that as a boy he spent many hours and days herding milk cows on the prairie. I have explained elsewhere about my grandfather's cheese-making activity to earn cash. I know that both grandfather and grandmother Maynard had teaching certificates in several states and Dakota Territory. I presume, therefore, that much of the early teaching of my father was done at home by them. He has told me of working lessons while riding in the saddle. I have not yet learned whether he went to school in Elk Point, or whether he or his younger sister attended elementary school in Beersford. I know that he graduated in a very small high school class from Beersford. I presume that Grandfather Maynard moved from Elk Point, where he had started a store, to Beersford, where he also had a store, in part at least for better schooling for the children. It may also have been that the railroad was coming through Hawarden and Beersford about that time, and that this was attractive to him. My father often mentioned the influence that the newspaper magazine, the Youth's Companion, had on him. He subscribed to it for we children also. I must confess that I found the Boy Scout magazine, Boy's Life, more appealing in my boyhood, although I did enjoy the Youth's Companion as well. I don't know, but I would imagine from the educational background that they had that my grandparents had a good many books and papers in their home. We children, of course, grew up in a home with many papers and many magazines. My father graduated from the University of South Dakota, then did graduate work at the University of Chicago. In both cases, he was among the early day students at each school. Later, he taught in colleges in Redfield, South Dakota, Carroll, Iowa, Adrian, Michigan, and at the University of South Dakota. Historians of the frontier have a saying that the average pioneer buried 3 wives. Life on the frontier was particularly difficult for women. My grandfather, Proctor Edwards Maynard's family, is a good illustration of the fact that the life was pretty rough for both men and women in the relatively frontier areas, and that because of the necessities of the times and circumstances, marriages after the death of one member of the family were very frequent, because he had half-brothers by the name of Howell and half-brothers by the name of Benton, as well as brothers by the name of Maynard, brothers and sisters by the name of Maynard, most of whom did not survive into very late adulthood. One of his half-brothers by the name of Benton and one of his brothers, Dexter Maynard, both studied medicine. Grandfather Maynard did have at least some academy education, 1 or more years of academy education before he enlisted in the Pennsylvania Volunteers. Perhaps it was because of this background of his brother's medical training, and perhaps it was because of the fact that he had a somewhat better educational background than a good many would have had, and it may have been just his personal interest. But for whatever reason, he apparently had considerable to do with the medical facilities for his company and perhaps his regiment in the years that he served from mid-1863 on to the end of the war. He seems to have been something equivalent to a medical orderly during that period of time. I have not yet gotten his service record from the War Department. I do intend to do so, but I just haven't done it as yet. But I know my father told me that he had considerable experience with the medical service while he was serving in his company. One of the interesting things that my father told about was the fact that the most frequent medical condition that they had to deal with in the period late 1863, 1864, early 1865 was the eating of soft soap. When enlisted men became tired of the war, wanted to be hospitalized and go home, what they did was to find somebody who had a batch of soft soap and eat a handful or two of that. Soft soap was, of course, made by fats that were saved in a barrel. Almost every farmhouse had a barrel in which they kept their various fats to turn into soap, and throwing wood ashes and lye. Wood ashes would be a potassium compound and have quite a lot of lye in them, and putting some lye in too. The effect on the internal mechanism of the enlisted men was pretty disastrous. Most of them had to be invalided out of the war, and the Army became pretty tough on those that did it, but nevertheless it was a fairly common thing. They did not use anesthetics. He has told about their having tried out a wooden skull cap that they could hit with a bung starter on the top of a man's head, and it would knock him out. It would give him a mild concussion and knock him out so that they could operate. The commonest operation was amputation, of course. Usually they amputated if the limb was at all badly injured. And the commonest way of sealing off the wound afterwards was with a hot iron. Just simply heated up a hot iron and ran it across the stump where the operation had been performed. And because of this background of at least some amateur, or perhaps a little better than amateur medicine that he had acquired during the war, when they were homesteading on the prairie, according to my father and my grandmother, quite frequently the Indians came to them for help when they had some condition that they couldn't deal with otherwise. And apparently Grandpa Maynard, for several years at least, did perform some practical home medicine out on the frontier in the area around Elk Point. I did not save many of the letters. I at one time had the letter press that my grandfather had used in his business in Beresford and in Hawarden, and I had some of the actual letters that my grandfather wrote, but most of those did not get saved, much to my very great regret. But one of the letters that I did save, and have been very glad that I did, was a letter that my grandfather wrote back to his mother in Pennsylvania, just after he had come out to the Elk Point area in 1868. He tells about bargaining with an Indian to buy a pony from him. They started out, the Indian wanting $50 greenback, or $50 gold, and various other things as well. And my grandfather bargaining with him until he got him down to $30 greenback, got him to throw in an Indian blanket, an Indian horsehair bridle, and an Indian riding quirt, rawhide riding quirt. He sent this riding quirt, which at the time that I was a small boy, his half-brother sent on to me, and as I remember it, it had a red gauntlet made out of red flannel and various other trimmings. The red gauntlet, the red flannel gauntlet, the blanket, and the horse hair bridle are, of course, long gone due to moths and buffalo bugs and all that sort of thing. But we did have for many years, my sister last had, the Indian rawhide riding quirt. It was had a wood handle and a braided quirt about, I'd say 1.5 or 2 feet long, and was at the time when I remember it as a boy quite flexible. Just what condition it's in now, I don't know. I haven't seen it for a number of years. This bargaining for the horse is a pretty good illustration of what the monetary situation was at the end of the Civil War. In 1868, there was a considerable depression. Of course, in 1873, one of the very bad depressions that we've had in this country came about. And the fact that even the Indian understood something of the difference between gold and greenbacks is an interesting point in connection with the monetary problems of the post-Civil War period. In going through my grandfather's letterpress book, which unfortunately did not get kept, and I've regretted that many times, one of the things that I found was a number of letters written by my grandfather to Montgomery Ward and Company, or from Montgomery Ward and Company to him. And that revealed something that I had not been aware of prior to that time, and which I don't think the general public was aware of. When Montgomery Ward and Company, which was the first mail-order house earlier by a few years in Sears Roebuck, when Montgomery Ward and Company was organized, it had a relationship with the Granger movement. The Granger movement was a sort of a lodge for farmers, and kind of a combination of labor union, farmers union, lodge, and social organization. The Grange movement still exists as a social organization. And in these letters, it is evident that Grandfather Maynard was acting as agent for Montgomery Ward in dealing with members of the Grange, and the relationship between the Grange, Montgomery Ward, and my grandfather as agent is not fully clear, but it is clear that Montgomery Ward was turning to him as the local representative, and that he was acting in part because he was a member of the Grange. This is particularly true at Bursford. Perhaps I should comment a bit about this letterpress. There was no carbon paper at that time, and the ink was iron oxide ink. This opened up the possibility, which was a fairly common practice even on into the early 10s and 20s of the 20th century. Not so common in the 20s, of course, because carbon paper had become available by that time. But it was a fairly common practice to have a book of what would really amount to tissue paper, a large book, and then a press that a little bit like a cider press that you could turn a wheel and press down very hard on the covers of the book. So what you did was to dampen one side of the tissue paper, place the letter on the other side, and tighten the press very tight, and leave it there for a given length of time. I don't know what the length of time was, probably not too long, and enough of the ink would be absorbed into the tissue paper, and the tissue paper was thin enough so that you could read through the tissue paper what the letter was. If you were to look at the side that had been pressed against the letter, you would, of course, get a mirror image. But you could read through the tissue paper, and yet the letter itself would not be damaged, because iron oxide ink could stand quite a little of that kind of treatment. So that you got a copy of a letter that was usually fairly legible. Depended, of course, on how much ink you used and how good your penmanship was, and so on. Most of the pens of that day were goose quills. I remember my father even was able to carve a pretty good goose quill pen, and occasionally used them. Occasionally he made them just for the benefit of we children. My grandfather, as was common with so many men of that generation, had a very florid, shaded style of penmanship. He could shade it even more when he wanted to. And these men took a great deal of pride in their penmanship. My father could do some of that, although not nearly to the extent that my grandfather's writing indicated. When Grandfather Maynard moved to Hawarden, he built the first brick store building in Hawarden proper, down near where the Farmers State Bank originally was located, next door to it, as a matter of fact. And a few years after he moved to Hawarden, I don't know the exact date, but in the early 1900s, he built a house on the corner across from what was then the Keniston home. The Kenistons had a cement block plant, and their home was built out of cement blocks. They were on one corner. He built a house on the corner just to the north, the northwest corner of that intersection. Apparently he realized that at some future time there would be a flood from Dry Creek. He apparently was concerned about it, because he had the lot filled in several feet above the street level and above the lot next to them and to the north, and other lots around there. When the flood did come in the 1920s, his house, he was gone, of course, by that time, but his house was one of the few houses in the area that was not flooded out. The store building was, the basement of it was, but the house was not. One other aspect of, one other aspect of his store building, which he built as the first store building, first brick building in that part of Hawarden, was the fact that he had a smokehouse behind the store building. I don't know when the smokehouse was last used. I think I remember its being used once or twice in my boyhood, but I cannot be sure of that recollection, and I do not know who would have been using it. Probably one of the butcher shops was renting it for that purpose. Smokehouses were, of course, used for smoking hams and bacon and various meats of that sort. As I've gone through the various papers and letters and things of that sort that were left from the houses in which we have lived, I have begun to put together a very incomplete picture of the social life of that time. Apparently, my Aunt Myra, who, of course, was the person for whom my sister Myra was named, had quite a little social life in downtown Hawarden with herself and the Stowe girls and a number of other young women of that time. This, of course, would have been necessary in that frontier society where there weren't movies, there weren't many other things to provide entertainment. Shifting the scene a bit, I think I will make a comment or two about Hawarden as a flour milling center. During my boyhood, Hawarden had two flour mills. One was located on the river in Calliope. The other was located on the Chicago Northwestern tracks near the depot in Hawarden. A man by the name of Ensign, if I remember correctly, ran the Calliope mill. The Calliope mill didn't operate very long after I got into the upper grades and high school, but it always fascinated me because it was a water-powered mill. It had big wooden gears and an intricate system for transferring the power from the water wheel. I don't remember now whether it was overshot or undershot, but I think it was overshot. The power the turning had to be transferred from that to the milling apparatus, the grinding and milling and rolling apparatus inside. And I always found that quite fascinating. I think it's unfortunate that that kind of equipment has been lost to present-day society. The other mill in downtown Hawarden was run by a man by the name of Schmucker. Mr. Schmucker was evidently a follower of one of the plain folk sects, perhaps the Mennonites or some group of that sort. He always had a long beard. That beard was always white with flour dust, and he was a very portly Pennsylvania Dutch type. I think he was of Pennsylvania Dutch origin, although I have never been very familiar with him. He was a very uncommunicative individual, but nevertheless a very kindly individual. We boys used to sit on his wall and sing songs, hoping that we could aggravate him, but I remember York Johnson and some of the other boys were involved in that kind of thing, but we never quite succeeded in doing it. He apparently was too kindly a man to be bothered by that kind of activity on the part of young people. Another phase of Hawarden's life in those days that I might comment on was the century bike rides. Bicycles came into general use in the 1880s and the 1890s. I remember my Aunt Myra's bicycle had wooden wheels and had cords instead of spokes as present-day wheels do. It was a much more simply constructed bike in some ways than today, less sturdy, of course. That's the bike on which I first learned to ride. One of the activities of that period was the century bike ride, and many of the young men, my father, Paramore, many of the other young men, prided themselves in having participated in century bike rides. In a century ride, the group, the individual or the group, set out to ride 100 miles in a day. Sometimes they rode 50 miles out and 50 miles back. Sometimes it was to ride a total of 100 miles. How they got back, I am not clear, whether they came back by train or whether they came back a day or two later on, but the practice was fairly common. East of Hawarden, where the land was more flat, this wouldn't have been too bad, but in the immediate Hawarden area, this could have been quite a chore. One other comment that I should make has to do with the Associated Church merger. I don't know exactly what role my father played in this. I know that he was involved in it to a considerable extent. I think he was at that time a church elder, probably of the Presbyterian Church. Grandfather Maynard and Grandmother Maynard and Aunt Myra Maynard had belonged to the Congregational Church, and perhaps my father did too, until he married my mother, who was a staunch Scotch Presbyterian. But in any case, he was rather definitely involved, perhaps because of his knowledge of the doctrinal questions involved, perhaps because of his role in the church itself. When the Presbyterian Church burned down, they had insurance money which they collected for the church. The Congregational Church, rather, had recently built a church and were having considerable trouble paying the mortgage on the church. The Presbyterian Church had a very good parsonage. The Congregational Church had a rather old-fashioned parsonage that was badly in need of repairs and rather unsatisfactory from several points. So the possibility of forming a merger of the two churches seemed to be worth looking at, and discussions were held. I remember my father telling me that they looked at the possibility of merger with every other church in town, including the Baptist Church, and to my surprise, the Dutch Reformed Church as well. I couldn't understand why they would consider that. The Dutch Reformed people held all-day services in their church. They had built a horse barn down near the creek, not far from the old stone schoolhouse, in order to keep their horses in comfort in the wintertime in their all-day long services. And since most of the services were in the Dutch language, I couldn't see why there was any logic to a merger between the Congregational Church, the Presbyterian Church, or some combination of those. My father explained Calvinist doctrines, the history of Calvinism, and the history of Calvinism in relation to the three churches, the Dutch Reformed, the Presbyterian, and the Congregational, and how there would be logic for it. I think that they considered merger with the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church. The only merger that appeared to make a great deal of sense was between the, and would be feasible from a doctrinal point of view, was between the Congregational and the Associated Church. This had some significance a short time later in my own life. In my years in high school, I was on the debate team, and in my senior year in high school, we won the championship of Northwest Iowa and went on to debate for the championship of the western half of Iowa. The debate question that year was the floating of a bond issue to hard surface Iowa's roads. Iowa was the most notorious state in the Union as far as the condition of its roads were concerned. There were all kinds of stories about them, and if you ever drove one of those Iowa clay roads, you know that the stories were all justified. The Lincoln Highway had been organized and built some years before, and the stretch through Iowa was universally regarded by everybody as impassable in rainy weather, or nearly so, and one of the worst stretches in the country. I have seen that clay mud in the area around Iowa City roll up on the front wheels of a Model T to a point where it was just impossible for the wheels to turn. The mud was caked in there so hard, and you had to chip it out some way to get it out. It was just thick, sticky mud. Then, of course, they got bad ruts in them. Oftentimes, in the spring breakup, the cars would get down to their oil pan and their axle, and there was just nothing for the wheels to take hold of. Horses sometimes got down to their bellies and found it almost impossible to get traction. So Iowa roads were very bad. And we had debated the question quite successfully, as I have indicated, of whether Iowa should float a bond issue or not. We debated on both sides of that question. Harvey S. Firestone of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company had for several years been having a Firestone Good Roads essay contest. Each year he took some aspect of Good Roads, or the people who organized the contest for him, took some aspect of Good Roads and offered a 4-year scholarship at any college or university in the country to the national winner of that essay contest. There was only the one winner. They did announce who were the winners in the state, in each state, and informally they did inform those who won and who wanted to know about what their position was among the contestants in the state finals. But there was only one prize, and that was the prize of a 4-year scholarship. I was prevailed upon in my senior year to write in this contest. You were to write a 700-word essay. It could not be more than 700 words. You had to get it down to that or a little less than that. I did write an essay in the contest. I started out with some 1,500 or 2,000 words, and eventually got it down to 700 words. That was one of the toughest jobs that I'd ever undertaken, and I learned a great deal about writing in the course of doing that. The school authorities submitted my essay, or perhaps I did, I don't remember. And along in the summer, when we were visiting relatives of my father's and some of these half-brothers, descendants of some of these half-brothers out in Nebraska, we got word that I had won the state contest. I had chosen as my theme for the contest the general theme for the contest was Good Roads and the religious life of the community. I had chosen as my theme a small community, somewhat imaginary, but somewhat like Hawarden, in which the good roads came to the community. The churches, of which there were too many, got together, organized into a merged church, and reduced the number of churches, brought in better preachers, and the community life was generally improved by it. My essay turned out to be the state winner, and I was informally told ranked about 10th in the national contest. The contest was won by a girl who was already in college in Ohio. She was the daughter of one of the college professors, and very evidently a very fine mind, and wrote a very fine essay. I could feel no regret over the fact that she had won, because it was a much better essay than mine, although I don't feel too badly about my own essay. I can see a lot of amateurism in it now, but it was, for a high school student, not an impossibly bad job, as I expect someone would say. Going back to the Associated Church merger, two ministers stand out in this Associated Church. The first was Reverend McIntosh, who had been the Presbyterian minister at the time that the merger took place, and who was the first minister of the combined Associated Church. He was a Nova Scotian Scotchman, rather austere, stern individual, but very high-minded, fine, kindly individual, and a very wholesome influence on the community. He was succeeded by a young man, Reverend Vance. Reverend Vance had been a coach of the Oregon Aggies, a football coach of the Oregon Aggies at the time when the Oregon Aggies was one of the outstanding teams in the country. I think he had been a line coach for them. He had been a missionary in Syria, and he'd had a very wide experience. He had a very dynamic personality, and he was just what the young people of the community needed, in my judgment. And his influence was very far-reaching on those young people, in fact everybody in the community who came under his influence. He had found it necessary to leave Oregon because of the health of his wife, and it was extremely fortunate that we could have him in our community. We wouldn't have been able to have brought him to the community without the bringing about of the Associated Church merger. Interestingly enough, I have, since that time, here in the Big Rapids, Michigan community, been chairman of the governing board of a United Church, which also is a merger of a Presbyterian and a Congregational church. So that a fair part of my life as a young person and as an adult has been in these merged churches.